We can go live to Tehran now to speak to our reporter, Hamid-Reza Homayounifar, who's authorised by Iran to speak to international media. Thank you very much for speaking to us. So a few days ago, we had a wave of anger on the streets because of the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And as we've just seen now, another wave of anger, but directed now at Iranian authorities because of the shooting down of that plane. What is the feeling like on the streets from the people who are protesting?
Rosie, the news was so shocking when the statement of the General Staff of Armed Forces of Iran came out accepting the shooting down of the plane. People here just were so devastated, shocked. A lot of people were crying, especially those who had relatives, friends, or family on the plane. They were really angry. And as a result of this anger, they came out to streets for 2 days on Saturday and Sunday. And the first one and the most important one was the two protests in front of the two major universities in Tehran, Sharif University and Amir Kabir University. Most of them were students, but later on other people from other parts of the society joined them. And they started showing their anger about what the actually Revolutionary Guards had done by mistake to shoot down the plane. And the important thing was at that time, people were just asking for those who were in charge to face justice. This is pretty much what has happened. Also, last night there were protests in different cities of Iran, and people went to streets. They were not students, they were just normal people. And we need to keep in mind that there were protests in Iran 2 months back in November. This has created a situation for some people to voice the concerns related to the issues in November too.
As we heard, the international community has been asking Tehran to let people protest peacefully, and that is sort of what we've been seeing. What's the response been then from the regime side?
In the past 2 days, although protesters have been kind of chanting against some authorities in the country, as well as even taking actions like taking down the posters or banners of Qasem Soleimani in a few scenes. The police, especially the anti-riot police, has tried to be peaceful and just disperse people, although tear gas has been used. But they have tried to avoid any type of harm to the protesters on the streets.
Thank you very much for giving us an update to what's happening in Tehran over the last few days, particularly over the weekend. Our reporter, Hamid-Reza Homayounifar. London, Berlin and the European Union have all been quick to condemn the detention of Britain's ambassador to Iran during Sunday's protests. UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab called the move a flagrant violation of international law, while the EU's top diplomat, Joseph Borrell, appealed for de-escalation and space for diplomacy. Ambassador Rob Macaire was arrested after attending a vigil for the victims of the downed airliner. He says he left after 5 minutes when demonstrators began chanting. Iranian authorities have summoned him to explain what they call his illegal and inappropriate presence at the gathering. Well, joining me now with the latest from Brussels is our correspondent Shona Murray. Morning to you, Shona. So we saw a very strong response from Brussels because of the detention of the UK ambassador. Are we expecting any further action from either side?
Well, I guess part of the character of this is that we don't know what's going to happen next. We can't predict what actions will take place from either side. We saw on Friday the United States applying more secondary and primary sanctions against Iran and officials close to the Iranian regime. We saw the Iranians accept responsibility for downing the Ukrainian plane, and also, as we know, as you mentioned there, Rosie, arresting, albeit for a short while, the UK ambassador. Here in Brussels, the priority really will be to keep tensions at bay and to really open channels or keep channels open for both sides to conduct some sort of diplomacy. I think that's where the EU says its strong ability to engage is. We saw an emergency Foreign Affairs Council meeting with all EU foreign affairs ministers on Friday. every one of them in unison saying that they are recommitting to the Iran deal, in spite of the fact that the United States has called on all the other partners, the UN Security Council and the EU, to walk away from it. Very much here in Brussels, they're standing by it.
They made it very clear last week, the EU, that they were focused on restoring, as you mentioned, the nuclear deal, but also on de-escalation. Do they have a unified approach about how best to go forward? And if so, what is that?
Well, that's an interesting question, Rosie, because while the EU is saying it's committed to the Iran deal, and on Friday once again said that it wants Iran to get back to the table, because as we know, a week ago, the Iranians said they're withdrawing from it. And since the America pulled out of it, Iran has been breaching the limits of the Iran deal. The EU says it's committed to the JCPOA, but it wasn't able to explain how it would get both sides back on track. So even just saying that the Iran deal should be preserved is not enough to ensure that actually both sides are committing to it, because as we know, Iran needs to commit to it to ensure that nuclear weapons are taken off the table, and the United States has to play its part to then lift sanctions from Iran, and that doesn't seem to be in play. There doesn't seem to be any appetite here in Brussels for a JCPOA too. Joseph Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, he said at the weekend that he was concerned about the arrest of the UK ambassador, wants to ensure that the EU can play its role from diplomatic way, but again wasn't able to say whether or not the EU would commit to reopening the JCPOA. He said the Iran deal was painstakingly negotiated, it's incredibly complex, and the one that's on the table is the one that they'll be looking to keep intact.